Why are those genocidal conflicts viewed with such indifference? First off, let's pivot back to, I guess, Israel-Palestine, since it is a very serious topic at the moment. We have to admit there's been a paradigmatic shift in the feelings around Palestinian humanity. The constant images of destruction and loss of life, I believe, is playing a massive role in this shift. The term genocide in this regard seems to be helping rally people around the cause for a ceasefire in the Western world. Would you guys agree?
I think that, yes, your characterization is a good one. And I think that it goes back to connecting the dots. The fact that the term genocide is one that has a legal definition, and it's tied into the Nuremberg trials, the international law that came out of those, as well as the International Criminal Court. So you now have a new kind of standard, something that has a more sort of objective condemnation rather than just like a contest of narratives. And what's unusual is that the most powerful central forces internationally, like specifically the United States, can't seem to push out of that. That's what makes it more significant, rather than the gravity or the nature of the genocidal crimes themselves, which are actually depressingly common.
Jean Bajlan?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to turn back to see how the origins of this term, what the origins of this term are, and how it came into being, and how it fits into our political discourse today. Because, of course, violence is very common, extreme levels of violence are very common, but the term genocide and the legal definition that Cooper points out is not about any type of violence directed against any type group of people, but rather is specifically a type of violence directed against a religious, ethnic, or racial group. So it is, in a sense, a kind of, it's not just violence, but it's violence directed against the people based on their identity, right? And so, that's an important thing to understand. How did this term come into being? So, Cuba, obviously, his co-national Raphael Lemkin, an individual born in what is today Belarus, but is historically, was part of Russia, and then before that, part of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was an individual born at the very beginning of the 20th century, and he witnessed the kind of intensification of ethnic and religious violence and the arrival of that intense ethnic and religious violence to Europe and the Middle East. When developing the concept of genocide, which he develops at the end of the First World War, he's not just drawing on the example of the Holocaust. We might think of the Holocaust as being the kind of ideal type genocide, just the kind of most extreme form of genocide. But he developed this concept, he developed this concept over an extended period. For example, one of the direct inspirations for thinking about the concept of genocide were the events of the Armenian genocide in 1915. How that played out in the interwar period. Lemkin was a kind of advocate for creating legal safeguards for religious and ethnic communities. Obviously, he was not successful in this, but after the barbarism of the Second World War and the refinement of this concept, this new concept of genocide that comes into being at the end of the First World War, this concept is taken up, and as Cooper points out, becomes a legal concept. So there is a kind of this. This is a crime that can be litigated in the international court system. So that's the origins of the term genocide, and that is why talking about genocide is it's not just a matter of propaganda for many people, but there are legal implications for this. There's a reason that, for example, Turkey doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide. Why? Because, of course, they fear there are legal implications for that recognition. So Israel obviously doesn't want to be seen as committing a genocide, even if that's what they are doing. But, there's an added level to this because it has legal ramifications for what that means.
And typically, when it comes to legal ramifications, that's been something that applies more to, let's say, middle and lower powers, right? It's extraordinarily dangerous if you're somebody like Slobodan Milosevic to be identified as a genocidaire. Then if that's an accusation that's leveled against Henry Kissinger. At the upper levels of imperial power, states can get away with it, essentially. And their diplomatic influence prevents any kind of judicial reckoning. What's remarkable about the Israeli case is that the United States hasn't been able to manage to float above the surface of legal accountability. Normally, power would be enough to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can't remember where I read it, but there was a journalist who reported, for example, that in private, I think it was the chief prosecutor for the ICC who said that, in conversations, leaders had said, this is for thugs like Putin and leaders in Africa. But the application of kind of accusations of genocide to Israel, which is, a small state but an influential state in the
and also
system.
The only democracy in the Middle East, and et cetera, having this really ambiguous position as a developed, right,
part of the quote unquote Western
country.
world. Yeah. So this is kind of like a sea change in the use of, on the application of genocide law. I think it speaks to perhaps a divide in the global liberal elite over Israel. I think, there is a section of not just, the usual people who are opposing, Israeli oppression of the Palestinians, but even amongst people who are fairly well established within the global foreign policy establishment, that Israel is going too far. Now, of course, Israel is countering by saying, well, this is not a genocide. We're letting aid in. It's not. And they're relying on the idea, of course, that when people hear the word genocide, they think Holocaust. This doesn't look like the Holocaust. This is not Israel. This is not Israel, taking Palestinians to the gas chamber. But what it does look like is the Armenian genocide, the massacre of Bosnian men in Srebrenica, plenty of cases in genocide, because, there's a kind of perception, well, unless they try and exterminate everybody, it can't really be called a genocide. But, to go back to the point that you made at the beginning, to constitute an act of genocide, you have this concept of killing members of a group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions for life calculated
collective
to bring about
punishment as well.
Collective punishment, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, forcibly transferring of children of one group to another. And that's important to understand because, in theory, you could have a genocide where no one is actually killed, but rather, you sterilize an entire population, seize their children. So, the core aspect of the concept of genocide is not purely related to the level of violence, but the intent of that violence. And that intent of that violence is to liquidate a particular quote unquote identity group. And and that's quite specific. So this wouldn't apply, for example, to, let's say, Stalin's campaign against the kulaks, right, against a particular social class. But people might apply that term to the deportation of, I don't know, Koreans into Central Asia as well.
And also, that is was part of the legal contention over enshrining genocide as an international crime, crime against humanity. Which categories would be included and excluded? And there's a reason that class identity was kept off of the list, just like sexual identity hadn't become a identifiable, actionable group yet. So originally it was limited to ethnic groups, national groups, religious groups, or racial groups.
Brother Robert.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I want to say about the situation in terms of the utility of the term genocide is that how much I think that one of the few things that we have that I think is valuable that leftists have done in the pre-October 7th era is set the foreground for the universal condemnation of hostility towards the Palestinians by the Israeli state with things such as the BDS movement and other things, increasing the consciousness of people left of center throughout the globe of the global disdain for the persecution of Palestinian people. What I'm basically saying is that I don't think we have this global outrage that we see in the world without the actual foundations that have been laid in the intermedium, not simply because of actions by the left like BDS, but also because the sheer outrage at the noxious politics of Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't think there's any, as much as Netanyahu argues that his job is to protect the sanctity of and sovereignty of Israel, I don't think that there has been an Israeli leader that has done more to politically threaten the sovereignty of the state of Israel through the increasing of the legitimacy of two-state or alternative state solutions than Benjamin Netanyahu. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that his form of political punishment towards Palestinians is so egregious is that it causes the legitimacy of the whole Israeli project to be up for grabs in the consciousness of even the most objective world observer. And it's only in that context that you can find that he is so absurd in the punishment that he lays out that the state of Israel and its leaders could be viewed by the International Criminal Court as potential genocidaires, as Kuba would say. So I am, as Jason opened up the show, somewhat not stunned, but somewhat sanguine with the extent to which the world is waking up to this horrific treatment that is not alone in the world, but I don't think that we should deny didn't get here without some level of work from our comrades on the left, but also as a consequence of these outrageous politics of the Netanyahu administration. I'd like to hear what you guys' thoughts on that.
I agree with that. I want to ask you guys kind of a quick follow up before we move
Well,
on.
I have a not necessarily a disagreement, but a re-emphasis. So, the Palestinian solidarity movement has been around for a long time. It's very well institutionalized in left circles, in universities. It's been going on for a long time, and as it should, because the issue has not been resolved. And I'm not saying that activism doesn't matter, or the fact that people have protested doesn't matter. But I think there are some specific changes that have been taking place beyond the Palestinian solidarity movement that have facilitated this shift in opinion regarding Israel, making it kind of more difficult for, let's say, Israel's allies to cover up, the ongoing persecution of the Palestinians. Number one of those things is that, throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, while behind the scenes, Israel was expanding settlements, was continuing to do the expropriation of Palestinian lands, was continuing with the military occupation, etc. There was because of the nature of media at that time in the West, discussions of Israel and Palestine were mediated through the mainstream press, and there was at least a kind of idea that there was some kind of negotiation process taking place, number one. And number two, even if you didn't blame everything on the Palestinians, you could say, well, the Israelis and the Palestinians, they Arafat turned down a good deal. Perhaps he shouldn't have turned that down. It's it's six of one, half a dozen of another. So it doesn't, it's just one of those things. These people have been killing each other for ages. What can we do about it? So there's that aspect. That doesn't exist anymore. Like, it's difficult for the mainstream press to control the flow of information. With the rise of social media, people can see with their own eyes what is happening. And yes, there's disinformation out there. Yes, there's pictures from Syria, which are being used, and people are saying that, oh, this is Palestine when it's Syria. But there are just some basic things out there. We see what the Israeli soldiers on TikTok are doing. The kind of the brutal stuff that they're doing. They're degrading of Palestinian houses. They're looting. They're plundering. Their language. We can hear what the Israeli politicians are saying. If you read the mainstream press, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on the things that, let's say, student protesters, you have 1,000 protesters, and one jackass in that protest says something like, well, all the Jews should go to Poland or something. And then the press picks that up. And then, that's the story. What's not being covered, of course, is what Israeli politicians are saying. That is not in the mainstream media, but social media, people see it. People get people can get direct access to that. So I think there's a lot more information out there. There's a lot more disinformation out there, but people are beginning to see that the whole only democracy in the Middle East discourse is not the reality of what's happening. Another tendency I want to emphasize is I think there is an elite level split on the Israel-Palestine question. There is a split amongst the foreign policy establishment, and that split amongst the foreign policy establishment in the US as well as in other parts of the world has been facilitated by the rightward drift of Israeli politics over the last decade and a half. The kind of rise of right populism, which alienates, your liberal foreign policy establishments. The Israeli diplomatic corps, the Israeli influence operation in the West historically was very good at projecting the idea that Israel was a normal Western democracy in a tough neighborhood, right? But over the last decade, you've seen Bibi Netanyahu, especially in the United States, intervene directly in American politics. Now, that hasn't necessarily filtered through to the elected politicians. Both Democrats and Republicans, by and large, are generally supportive of Israel, with a few exceptions. But I think within the foreign policy establishment, and I think Kuba could speak to this as well, there is a sense like Israel is just out of control. They're not even allowing the United States to maintain the cover that the long-term objective is a two-state solution, because the Israelis are saying contradictory things. They're saying for example, they say Hamas wants to destroy Israel. They're against the two-state solution. Therefore, any move towards a two-state solution would be rewarding Hamas. That doesn't make sense unless, of course, when they say Hamas, what they really mean is the entire Palestinian population. And along with the right politics, the rise of these hardcore religious movements in Israel, the settler groups, the rightward drift of the Israeli youth. We always associate the youth with being progressive. In a place like Israel, that's not the case. The youth is generally more nationalistic. With the outflowing of liberal Israelis, many of whom will get sick of it and move to Germany and places like that, Israel is becoming a more hardline right-wing country. It's leaning into this kind of populist discourse, which is alienating liberals. That's why you see a lot of liberals who are now critical of Israel, being critical of Israel, but framing it in terms of Bibi Netanyahu and his, bad settler buddies. And they want to kind of get back to the old kind of Ashkenazi, Europeanized elites, rather than, someone like Ben Gvir as my Kurdish brother, right? Because he's a Mizrahi Jew. One of the things that a lot of the discourse about Israel-Palestine gets wrong is they're all Polish and Lithuanian. No, they're not all Polish and Lithuanian. The vanguard of some of the most hardcore groups are Mizrahi Jews. People from Mizrahi is a kind of like a neologism. It's like the brown Jews, right? They're people who were kicked out of all the Arab countries in 1948 and who don't have a place to go, and so who engage in the kind of typical sectarian politics that you see in other parts of the Middle East, right? Who are like, religious
Lebanon.
Lebanon, right? So I think the solidarity movement is important to consider, but it has to be understood in the context of splits over Israel and the global elite, the transformation of Israel over the last decade, the increase, the like someone like
Israel has
someone
also
like
become.
well, just a final point. Someone like Ben Gavir, yeah, and the Khanis, these were extremists, right? These were people who were like associated with Yitzhak Rabin's assassination.
And Meir Kahane, the
Kahanists.
was kind of a celebrity reactionary among rabbis.
Yeah, so you have this. These people were seen as fringe in Israel, right? These guys are now at the core center of power, and these guys won't stop saying genocidal things. As much as the Israeli state is trying to say, like, we're not doing a genocide. If we wanted to do a genocide, we'd kill even more people. Well, that's not a good excuse.
Not reassuring, by the way.
Not at all. That's like the worst thing ever.
But
and let me just make one. People will say, well, the Israelis let aid in and things like that, and so yes, there might be bad people. This is how genocides usually are. In the Armenian genocide, Armenians were mass murdered, but the American Red Cross was allowed to operate in refugee camps for Armenians in the Syrian desert. Right?
Even in the Holocaust.
Even in the Holocaust, you had like the
Red Cross was moving packages around, and there had to be a parallel registry for individuals because the real mistreatment was being denied officially, right? Whereas, so yeah, even in the most extreme cases, there's still this veneer of civility and deniability around the genocide as it's taking place.